People say that my aunt got her position through her body. They say she pretended to take care of me but went to my husband's room every night. People accuse her of being shameless, even trying to seduce her own niece's husband. But she gave me a piece of candy and said, "Yingying, let's live through this life together."
1.
On a sunny spring day, my aunt took me to play in the creek. I was 7 this year and my aunt was 17. She was here to look after me. She accidentally slipped and fell, getting completely soaked. I wanted to call for the maid, but she stopped me and even scooped up water to make her hair wetter. Clear droplets slid down her neck like pearls on white jade. My husband, Yingying, was riding by on a horse. He frowned and said sternly, "How inappropriate." I was scared and hid behind my aunt. Yingying was known to kill people. Several of my maidservants who came with me were killed by him. But my aunt wasn't afraid. She stood barefoot in the water, looked up at him, and said softly, "Your Highness, my clothes are wet. May I borrow your cloak?" Yingying looked at her coldly. I was about to kneel and plead for my aunt, but Yingying just took off his cloak and threw it on her, then rode away. Only then did I dare to breathe freely and remind my aunt to stay away from Yingying next time. My aunt patted my face and said, "Yingying, don't be afraid. Auntie will protect you." That night, my aunt was nowhere to be found, and I couldn't find her anywhere. Then I overheard the old maid looking after me say, "Princess Yingying is truly shameless. She came to our residence under the pretense of taking care of her niece, but is actually trying to seduce her niece's husband." Did you see her enter His Highness's room with your own eyes? Of course, I saw it with my own eyes. She was wearing His Highness's cloak and was almost naked underneath. They said she had been flirting with Yingying even on her way here. Yingying had tried to kill her several times, but she showed no awareness. I was sent to Bei Qi for marriage at the age of 5. 2 years later, my aunt was sent here to serve the ailing old emperor. Though the old emperor has passed away, she is still a consort but has voluntarily gone to her son's room. Our Highness despises women from Wu. Just watch. Soon he'll send someone to clean up her body. I hurried to Yingying's room. My aunt was the kindest person to me in this world, apart from my mother. I didn't want her to die. But the guards at the door wouldn't let me in, so I could only cry and make a fuss. Then my aunt's voice came from inside. "Yingying, go back for now. I'll be back soon." She told me to be obedient and said she wouldn't lie to me. I didn't believe her.
She sounded so weak.
The guards carried me away and locked me in a room. I waited and waited, but my aunt never came back. Even when I fell asleep, she had lied to me. She clearly said she'd be back soon.
2.
In the morning, my aunt was helped back. When she drank water, she could barely hold the cup. The maids mocked her, saying, "I heard she begged several times last night. How pathetic." I thought she was formidable, but turns out she's just pretty to look at and useless. She doesn't even measure up. She thinks our Highness is like those weaklings from Wu. My aunt said nothing and just applied some ointment on her body. Her maidservants were nervous. "Princess, what if the Bei Qi royal family asks about this?" My aunt calmly replied, "I know how to handle it." I held her hand and said, "Auntie, let's escape. I know a way out through a dog hole in the courtyard." She smiled and put a piece of candy in my mouth. "Yingying, let's not escape this time. This time, we'll live through this life together." I didn't understand what she meant by this life and that life. After applying the ointment, my aunt fell asleep, unmoving. I stayed by her bedside, checking her breath from time to time. Fortunately, she was still alive. During this time, Yingying also came by once. When I was sent to his residence, he was 17 as well. He was taller than my eldest brother and more handsome than my most handsome brother. He looked at me and said that people from Wu were really barbaric, sending such a young child for marriage. My maidservant laughed and said that although I was young, I was the most beautiful among Wu's princesses and would be able to serve people well after a few years. Then Yingying raised his hand, and the maidservant's head fell off. I heard he conquered several cities of Wu. I heard countless Wu people died at his hands. I cautiously stood in front of him and said, You can't kill my aunt. She's a good person." Yingying snorted and said I was a little fool. I wasn't angry. Since I was young, everyone said I was a fool. Only my mother and aunt said I wasn't a fool, just someone who had been frightened. They said that when I grew up and recovered from my illness, I would be a wise and beautiful young woman. Yingying was very strange today. He didn't draw his sword but just quietly watched my aunt. So I could only watch too. My aunt was very beautiful, just like my mother. She looked beautiful when she smiled and when she slept, as soft and delicate as the finest velvet. But I liked it most when she used a bamboo pole to pick lotus seeds on the lake. She would make me hair accessories from lotus flowers and an umbrella from lotus leaves. When she looked down, even the wind became gentle. I told Yingying about these things, hoping he would see how good my aunt was and not be angry with her. Yingying finally left but took me with him. He said I was noisier than the chattering sparrows from Bei Qi and kept jabbering. He told me to play in another courtyard and not disturb my aunt's rest. I sighed with relief. If he told my aunt to sleep, didn't that mean he wouldn't kill her? 3. For several nights in a row, when I woke up, my aunt was not there. In the morning, she would return from outside, stepping on dewdrops, then bathe, apply medicine, and sleep. Her maidservants said she seemed like a different person. When we left Wu, the princess was still normal. How did she change once we arrived in Bei Qi? Yes, that night at the inn, I saw her eavesdropping outside His Highness's room, even though she used to be so timid. Could it be that our emperor instructed her to spy on military affairs? But they found it strange. If she was spying, she should have tried to seduce the crown prince of Bei Qi, not an insignificant prince. They couldn't figure it out and eventually looked at me, sighing. Princess Mingzhao will eventually grow up. Will she and her aunt have to share a husband? I didn't understand what they were talking about. Anyway, wherever my aunt was, I was there too. After she woke up, my aunt taught me to read and write, and she herself learned about Bei Qi's culture. She even painted a portrait of Yingying, showing him on horseback, handsome and spirited. But Yingying threw the portrait away and told her to stop trying to curry favor. He said, "Don't think that because you've pleased me a few times, you can act with impunity. You're just a plaything." My aunt bit her lip, tears welling up in her eyes. But once Yingying left, she didn't shed another tear. The maidservants advised her not to focus her thoughts on Yingying. According to Bei Qi customs, the father's concubines are inherited by the son. Now that the new emperor had ascended the throne, my aunt was surely destined to become his consort. My aunt still replied, "I know how to handle things."
4.
At a banquet in the Bei Qi palace, both my aunt and I attended. I sat beside Yingying while my aunt sat alone. The new emperor drank wine, casting glances at my aunt and then at me. I didn't like the new emperor's eyes. They were like a bowl of overcooked oil soup. I moved closer to Yingying. Though he had killed people, he had never looked at me with such eyes. Yingying put a sweet fruit in my hand, telling me to eat and not look around. I felt he was angry, but his face was calm. The new emperor made my aunt dance, and she had to do it barefoot. My aunt obediently took off her shoes and danced at the banquet. She wasn't very skilled at dancing. She was the youngest sister of my father, born to a palace maid. Although she was a princess, she wasn't favored. She and her mother had a hard life in the palace. Sometimes she had to do embroidery work to earn money. My mother often sent them food and clothing. When her mother passed away, my mother brought her to live in our palace. At that time, my mother only taught her painting and poetry, never dance. But now, her dancing was remarkably good. She twirled gracefully, her palace dress spreading out like a blooming lotus flower, and her delicate feet were like the lotus stamens. The new emperor and the officials applauded. The new emperor even invited my aunt to sit beside him. My aunt obediently moved over, and the emperor touched her hand. But I noticed she kept secretly glancing at Yingying. She looked pitiful and quite aggrieved. Yingying kept his head down, drinking cup after cup of wine. He rarely drank, saying that alcohol clouded the mind. By the time the banquet ended, it was already night. The new emperor wanted my aunt to stay, but the Empress Dowager said she was tired from dancing and should return to her residence to rest. When we left the palace together, I suddenly felt unwell and cried for my aunt. Yingying had no choice but to let my aunt come to our carriage. My aunt anxiously held me and said, "You were fine at the banquet. How did you suddenly become ill?" Yingying said he didn't know and asked whether she should take me to the Junwang residence or to her place. My aunt said to take me to her place. Yingying jumped down from the carriage without a word, his silver tassels jingling. I felt he was angry. He seemed more angry in these few days than he had been in the past 2 years. My aunt said nothing, only soothing me gently. After a while, the carriage suddenly stopped. Yingying lifted the curtain and coldly told my aunt, "What good medicine can you have there? Go to my residence." My aunt hesitated for a moment, then quietly agreed. When Yingying turned away, I saw a faint smile at the corner of her mouth.
5.
I took the medicine and fell into a drowsy sleep. I dreamed of my father and mother. My father was sending me for marriage, and my mother was kneeling on the ground, her head bleeding, saying I was too young and not clever enough. It would be a dead end for me. My aunt also begged my father, saying she was willing to go in my place. My father said Bei Qi only wanted legitimate princesses, and he couldn't refuse. So little me was sent off with the marriage entourage. My mother and aunt followed behind, crying and chasing until they fell to the ground. I got farther and farther away from them. When I woke up, my mother and aunt were not there. The room was empty, and I felt a bit scared. I went outside and saw Yingying sitting on a chair, his back to me. Just as I was about to ask why he was here, I saw my aunt. She was sitting on Yingying's lap, her clothes disheveled, swaying like an iris in the wind. She spoke with a sobbing tone. "Your Highness, please keep me by your side. I'm willing to be your servant. I don't want to enter the palace. If you want me to enter the palace, only if you become the emperor." Yingying gritted his teeth and said, "Don't think you can drive a wedge between me and my elder brother." My aunt cried even harder. I thought, this is bad. Yingying dislikes people crying the most. When I first entered the residence, I always cried, and he had several times wanted to throw me out to feed the wolves. Just as I was about to go over and plead with Yingying, a maid suddenly appeared, covering my mouth and carrying me away. I cried, saying my aunt might be fed to the wolves and that I wanted to save her. The maidservant said my aunt was the one feeding the wolves and told me to go to sleep. I cried myself to sleep. When I woke up again, it was daylight. My aunt was at the mirror, getting ready. I threw myself into her arms. She was still alive, which was so good. She touched my forehead and asked if I had slept well. I said I had a dream. She smiled and asked what I dreamed about. I said I dreamt of my mother. I said it was the first time I had dreamed of my mother since coming to Bei Qi. She paused, her smile fading. She gently told me, "Because the road is too long, your mother arrived a bit late." But she was crying. I asked why she was crying. She wiped away her tears and said it was nothing, just that the wind had blown into her eyes.
6.
My aunt still had to enter the palace as a consort. The palace matron said that the new emperor was very fond of her, and the imperial decree had already been issued. She was to enter the palace in 3 days. They also mentioned that she did not have the favor of the Empress Dowager or the Empress, and wondered how long she could last. The new emperor also issued an edict for Yingying, commanding him to go to war, specifically to attack the Western Rome, a place much farther away than our Wu land. People in the palace said that the Empress Dowager and the new emperor were wary of him, and he might not return from this mission. On the day my aunt entered the palace, Yingying was again drinking, one cup after another. He saw me and waved me over. I hesitated and walked to his side. He asked me, "What was your aunt doing yesterday?" I thought carefully and told him that my aunt had been watching summer cicadas all day. She had looked at the cicadas and said to them, "When we meet again in the next life, we will treat each other well." Last night, my aunt had asked me to remember this phrase clearly. If Yingying asked about her, I was to tell him this sentence. If he did not ask, I was to say nothing and quietly eat and sleep in the palace. Yingying listened and was silent for a long time before suddenly asking me, Mingzhao, do you want to go back to Wu Land? I nodded eagerly. I really wanted to go back. I missed my mother, as well as my grandparents and uncles. He called me a little fool, and said being a little fool was not so bad. That night, a sudden announcement came from the palace. The Empress Dowager wanted to execute my aunt, because she was found to be pregnant. They said that when my aunt married the old emperor, he was already on his deathbed and had never consummated the marriage with her. Therefore, the child in her womb must be fathered by some other man. The Empress Dowager pressed my aunt for the identity of the child's father, and my aunt was beaten so badly that she miscarried on the spot and still did not reveal the father's identity. Yingying's eyes turned red when he heard this, and he immediately entered the palace. I wanted to follow, as my aunt was a princess and could not be casually executed by the people of Bei Qi. But the maidservants said that a princess from Wu Land in Bei Qi was sometimes worse than the lowest servant. Yingying was gone for half a month. When I saw him again, he was seated on the dragon throne. He was dressed in the same clothes as the new emperor, looking even more fearsome than before. He waved me over. I cautiously walked to his side. He handed me a pastry from a tray and said, Mingzhao, in a few days, you will become the Empress of Bei Qi, but in the future, I will let you return to being a princess. I didn't care about being an empress or a princess. I only asked, what about my aunt? He said my aunt was also in the palace and had someone take me to her. 7. My aunt lived in a small palace. When I arrived, she was asleep. She had lost a lot of weight and furrowed her brow in her sleep, as if she was troubled by something in her dreams. She kept calling out, sister-in-law, Shaoling, don't leave me alone. Normally, she called my mother sister-in-law. Shaoling was my uncle's name. My uncle was the best young man in Wu Land. On the day I left for marriage, my uncle had said to me, Yingying, I will come to fetch you home. But after 2 years, he still hadn't come. Tears streamed down my aunt's face, soaking her pillow. I hurriedly woke her up. When she saw me, she tightly embraced me and asked if I had been eating and sleeping well these days. I shook my head. Without you, I can't eat or sleep well. She promised me that we would never be separated for such long periods again. 3 days later, I was appointed as the Empress of Bei Qi. Because of my young age, Yingying had my aunt come to take care of me. The palace servants said he had originally intended to make my aunt a consort, but the officials outside had caused an uproar. They said he had already killed many people for my aunt, and making her a consort might cause unrest in Bei Qi. In the end, he compromised, not giving her any official title but allowing her to stay in my palace to take care of me. Although she was just taking care of me, she enjoyed the same treatment as I did. Every day, we had endless fine clothes and exquisite food. In this vast palace, my aunt and I could run freely, with countless servants attending to us. When I was tired of playing, I lay in my aunt's arms, inhaling her faint fragrance and said, Aunt, Yingying is really a good person. But she coldly replied, he is not a good person. He is a demon. Even so, when Yingying came in the evening, she still timidly threw herself into his arms. My palace had a warm pool where she and Yingying would stay for 1 or 2 hours before coming out. They also spent the night together. In the morning, my aunt dressed and styled Yingying. He said the palace servants could do it. My aunt refused, saying he was her husband and she didn't want to rely on others. Yingying looked at her with a slight smile at the corner of his mouth. He rarely smiled like that. When he did, he looked very handsome. I suddenly remembered my uncle. When he was with my aunt, he also smiled like that. Back then, my mother had said that when they were older, she would make them a couple. My uncle had looked at her eagerly and said, Sister, you must keep your promise. My mother had laughed. Of course I will. My aunt had blushed. Even her ears were trembling pink. But now, my aunt had gone off for marriage. Who did my uncle end up marrying?
8.
Several beautiful girls from the previous dynasty were sent into the harem. They were all daughters of prominent families from Bei Qi. Every day they came to greet me. Although they performed the proper courtesies, their gazes towards me and my aunt were unfriendly. I overheard them saying that my aunt had risen to her position through her body, claiming she used secret drugs to make Yingying stay with her every night. They also said that I, like my aunt, was a lowly creature. Even though I was naive, I knew that being called a lowly creature was an insult. I argued with them. I couldn't win. My aunt told me not to be angry, saying that these people would soon be like a passing cloud. She took very bitter medicine every day. She said she needed to get pregnant again soon to ensure that Yingying would protect her and me. 3 months later, my aunt was diagnosed with pregnancy. Yingying was very happy. My aunt nestled in his arms, placing his hand on her abdomen, and said, "Ah Zheng, the child we lost has returned." "Yes, it has returned," Yingying said with some sadness. My aunt hugged his neck and asked, "Ah Zheng, will you come to be with me every day? I always feel uneasy. I'm afraid our child might be lost again." Okay, Yingying agreed. Yingying appointed my aunt as a noble consort but still had her live in the empress's quarters. Some people said she was actually the empress, and I was just a puppet for her and Yingying. The voices of opposition from the officials grew quieter as Yingying killed many more people. Those who were sentenced cursed him for killing his brother and usurping the throne for a woman, condemning him to an ill fate in the future. My aunt was also attacked by a palace maid, but before the maid could succeed, she was captured by the secret guards Yingying had arranged. The maid, before dying, looked at my aunt with malice. "Li Ruafu, you vixen. You clearly lost the child yourself by bumping your belly, but you accuse the Empress Dowager. You've bewitched His Majesty and turned him against his family. May you die a terrible death. You will descend to the 18th layer of hell and never be reborn." My aunt approached her, holding her belly, and said, "I have already been to hell. Nothing is more terrifying than this world." I looked at my aunt, seeing a look on her face I had never seen before. Cold and desolate. Yingying rushed over and my aunt fainted in his arms. That night, Yingying stayed by my aunt's bedside. I was too anxious to sleep and stayed by her side, worried. My aunt cried in her sleep again. Yingying wiped her tears and she tightly held his hand. She called him Shaoling. Yingying was momentarily stunned. Seeing that my aunt did not wake up, he asked me, "Mingzhao, who is Shaoling?" I was about to say it was my uncle, but at that moment, I suddenly realized I couldn't say that. So I replied, "I don't know." He did not doubt me, because I was a little fool. A little fool not knowing was understandable. The next day, when my aunt woke up, Yingying did not ask her about Shaoling but only told her to rest well and that he would visit her after court. But I told my aunt. She asked if I had said Shaoling was my uncle. I shook my head. No, I wanted to tell him, but didn't know why I felt I shouldn't. My aunt was stunned, tears in her eyes, and said, "Our awing is finally getting better."
9.
3 months later, my aunt gave birth to a princess. Yingying was very happy and named the little princess Bei Qi with the title Yongla. The little princess was thin and small, like a tiny kitten, crying at the slightest sound. The imperial doctor said it was because my aunt had been in poor spirits and had been startled during her pregnancy, so the child was somewhat underdeveloped. Yingying and my aunt raised the child together and asked me to accompany them. He smiled at me and said, "Mingzhao, I hope Bei Qi will grow up safely just like you, thanks to your good fortune." I nodded in agreement, but my aunt did not speak. I felt that she might not like Bei Qi. For example, when Yingying was present, she would treat Bei Qi well. But once Yingying left, she would say she was tired and let the wet nurse take Bei Qi away without even looking at her. "And, don't you like Bei Qi?" I asked her. She looked up at the sky for a long time before replying, "I want to like her, but I can't." I didn't understand why a mother wouldn't like her own child. My mother loves me. Even though I am a little fool, she treasures me. My aunt also said that since I had noticed this, Yingying must have noticed as well. So she had the wet nurse deliberately mention in front of Heelanjung that a woman might neglect her child after giving birth due to fatigue, hoping Heelanjung would pay more attention to my aunt. Heelanjung then promoted my aunt to imperial consort, just a step away from the empress position. The maidservants who came with us from Wu Land were very happy, saying that now the empress and imperial consort of Bei Qi were both from Wu Land, and the lives of the people in Wu Land would surely improve. I happily went to find my aunt and said, "Now my father must not be sighing every day anymore." My aunt, trimming flower branches, replied, "No, he must be very restless." I was puzzled. Why? But she didn't say anything more. However, I found out the answer a year later when Heelanjung ordered a southern campaign against our Wu Land. On the day I heard the news, I anxiously ran through the long palace corridors. I wanted to tell my aunt, and then we would beg Heelanjung not to go to war. My aunt was embroidering by the window, while 1-year-old Bei Qi and the palace maids played in the courtyard. When she saw me, she called me sister in a soft and tender voice. She was smarter than me and could speak at just 1 year old. I urgently told my aunt about the southern campaign. My aunt replied, "Yingying, we're finally going home." Home, such a beautiful word. But why was I not happy?
9.
Heelanjung personally led an army of 200,000 southwards. My aunt, Bei Qi, and I accompanied him. We were originally supposed to stay in the Bei Qi palace, but before the army moved south, my aunt and I were attacked again. To protect me, my aunt's arm was injured by an assassin. She pleaded with Heelanjung to take us with him, fearing that if he left, we would be harmed by others. The ministers opposed this, saying that my aunt, as a princess of Wu Land, would be like keeping a poisonous scorpion by his side. One could never tell when it might sting. That night, my aunt knelt before Heelanjung and said, "Your Majesty, I am not a scorpion. I am just a trumpet creeper, and I only wish to be a trumpet creeper clinging to your Majesty." Heelanjung gently stroked her hair and said, "I thought you preferred hibiscus." My aunt climbed onto his lap, tilting her head to look at him. "I used to like hibiscus, but people change." She was lying. She didn't like trumpet creepers or hibiscus. She liked the golden peach blossom. There was a tree of it in my uncle's courtyard, its flowers pink and white, and after they fell, the tree's leaves were lush and green. It was unique in the world, splendid and magnificent. Heelanjung gazed at my aunt for a long time. "Ruofu, I even killed my own brother. You'd better not lie to me." My aunt raised her hand. "I, Li Ruofu, swear that if I deceive you, Heelanjung, I will fall into the 18th layer of hell and never be reincarnated." After saying this, she wrapped her arms around Heelanjung's neck and kissed his lips. The palace maids and eunuchs all stepped out and closed the door. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat on the steps outside the palace, looking at the stars. I heard the wind rustling the leaves, the summer insects chirping, and my aunt's voice, which was both weeping and tender. The nanny who took care of me told me that this was what happens between a man and a woman. She also said that since I was now 11 years old, in 3 or 4 years, I would also have to serve Heelanjung in this way. I felt dejected. Even though I wasn't afraid of Heelanjung anymore, and I liked eating and reading with him, that was all. I just wanted to be a princess again and return to my mother's side. Moreover, Heelanjung had promised to make me a princess again. After dawn, my aunt had the palace servants start packing. Heelanjung agreed to take us south. The maidservants who had come with us from Wu Land were both happy and worried. They were happy because they could return to their hometown in their lifetime. They were worried because war brought death, and they didn't know if their families would be spared. On the day the army set out, I sat in the carriage and looked back at the capital of Bei Qi. I had spent 5 years here. I said goodbye to it. I hoped never to return. My aunt didn't look back. She covered her mouth and vomited quietly. I hurriedly asked her what was wrong, and she said it was due to the jolting of the carriage and asked me not to tell anyone. I nodded in agreement.
10.
The Bei Qi army advanced like a hot knife through butter and reached the Wu Land fortress of Yinzhou within a month. The army camped outside the city, surrounding Yunzhou so tightly that not a drop of water could pass through. I looked at the walls of Yunzhou, wondering if my uncle was up there. Previously, my uncle had said that when he turned 17, he would guard Yunzhou and prevent the Bei Qi army from entering Wu land. But I looked for a long time and saw no sign of him. On the 5th day of the siege, the city gates opened to reveal envoys from Wu land. They came to negotiate. My father was willing to exchange millions in gold, silver, and silk, along with 3,000 maidens, for Bei Qi to withdraw its troops. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. When I was sent to Bei Qi at the age of 5, my father and mother had said that by sending me away, Wu land's thousands of maidens could stay with their parents. After crying for a long time, my mother finally let go of me. But now, why were so many maidens being sent? Yingying asked my aunt, "What do you think?" My aunt replied, "I do not discuss state affairs. Everything is up to your majesty." Yingying rejected the envoys' proposal and executed them instead. The envoys, terrified, begged for mercy from my aunt and me. My aunt, however, remained calm, as if she was expecting them to die. One young envoy rushed to my aunt and said, "Princess, since we almost became husband and wife, please don't kill me. I am willing to serve you and His Majesty." I then realized that my aunt had been betrothed to someone before coming here. Yingying seemed to be unaware as he glanced at my aunt, and the generals whispered among themselves. My aunt did not plead for that man. The envoys were quickly executed, and their heads were displayed at the city gates. Yingying ordered everyone to leave except for my aunt. I secretly hid outside the tent and heard him ask her, "Did you come here willingly?" My aunt answered, "Yes."
Why? For eyeing.
She is alone here, and I couldn't rest easy. Yingying did not question her further and believed her. But I felt something was off. I had a feeling that my aunt's intentions were not just to accompany me. She seemed to have a larger purpose. 11. The next day, Yingying ordered the attack on the city. The commanders defending Yunzhou still showed some resistance and fought valiantly. But the Bei Qi army was too powerful. It was said that Yunzhou hadn't received rations from the court for a long time, and no matter how brave the defenders were, they couldn't withstand hunger and illness. After a month of resistance, the city was finally breached. On the day Yunzhou fell, Yingying personally decapitated the commander of Yunzhou. To reward his troops, he allowed the Bei Qi army to loot the city for 7 days, taking gold, silver, and women as they pleased, and killing the citizens at will. I finally understood why my aunt called him a devil. I knelt and pleaded with him, "Your Majesty, the common people are innocent. Please retract your order." He didn't listen and had me removed. I clung to his clothes and wouldn't let go until my aunt arrived. She removed her outer robe, and her belly had started to show slightly. She said she was 4 months pregnant and begged Yingying for the sake of the child not to order the massacre. Yingying's hand rested on her belly, his voice cold. "So you were already pregnant when the army set out. Why did you only tell me now?" My aunt replied, "Your Majesty, you were busy with military affairs. I did not dare to disturb you." Yingying pinched her face hard. "Are you plotting against me for Wu land?" My aunt said she wasn't. She explained that before the army left, she had a dream where Yingying unified the world but was assassinated at the age of 27 due to atrocities like massacring cities. Her hand covered Yingying's large hand, tears streaming down her face. That dream felt so real. "I'm scared. I've already lost too much in this life. I don't want to lose you too." At this moment, Bei Qi also started crying and hugged Yingying's leg. "Father, don't hurt mother." Yingying looked at Bei Qi and eventually relented. He also forbade the massacre. The soldiers were dissatisfied, but he made a few of the main generals kings and promised rewards after Wu land was conquered. Thus, the matter was settled. However, he and my aunt stopped talking to each other. In fact, he even accepted several beautiful maidens sent by others. That night, he summoned them all to his tent. The generals said he should have done this earlier, as my aunt had been overly favored for too long. An emperor should never be excessively partial. Even if my aunt was truly a beauty of the nation, it didn't matter. I went to see my aunt. She sat quietly by the lamp, and I could still faintly hear the laughter of the young maidens outside. "Aunt, don't be sad." I comforted her. She smiled at me. "I'm not sad." I couldn't tell if she was being honest or not. She sat there for a very long time that night. For the next few months, Yingying did not summon her. Everyone said she had fallen out of favor and that after the child was born, she would be discarded while the child was kept. My aunt seemed indifferent. She always gazed at the direction of Wu Land for a long time. She stretched her arms out in the breeze, like a birch tree in spring or a butterfly about to be carried away by the wind.
12.
After the fall of Yunzhou, the Bei Qi army's advance into Wu Land was like taking candy from a baby. Within 3 months, the army reached the gates of Yingying. My father knelt before the city gates, removed his crown, and submitted to Yingying. I hadn't seen him for 6 years. He looked the same as when I left, still handsome and refined. But his eyes had become clouded, much like the oily eyes of the new Bei Qi emperor. I searched for everyone but couldn't find my mother or my maternal relatives. I seemed to understand something, and tears fell uncontrollably. My aunt, supporting her belly, got down from the carriage. "I pay my respects to Her Majesty, the Empress." My father bowed to my aunt. His body trembled. My aunt smiled. "Are you frightened now? What will you do when you have many more days of worry ahead?" That day, I finally learned that in the 2nd year of my marriage, my maternal relatives had been executed for treason. After cursing my father, my mother had committed suicide by crashing into a pillar. The only one who escaped, my uncle, was forced back by my father using my aunt's life as leverage. He was shot and killed at the city gates. His corpse was hung at the city gate, exposed to the sun and rain, and hadn't been taken down by the time my aunt went to marry. That day, my aunt passed by his white bones in a bright red wedding dress, and the wind made the bones rattle. My father begged, "Ah Fu, we're siblings. Please help your brother." My aunt shook her head. "I am not your sister. Your sister, Ah Fu, has long since turned to bones in Bei Qi." My father's face grew increasingly grim. "Li Ruofu, for the sake of Wei Shaoling, you disregard your own family and country." I instinctively wanted to cover my father's mouth. But Yingying had already heard. 13. Yingying finally learned who Shaoling was. That day, he killed many people, including the royal family and nobles of Wu Land. At night, he kicked open the door of my aunt's bedroom and grabbed her thin shoulders, pulling her off the bed. "So, you approached me to avenge Wei Shaoling, didn't you? Our first child. Was it deliberately miscarried by you, so that I would save you? You gave birth to Bei Qi. Was she also a tool to help you gain power?" My aunt looked at him and remained silent. Sometimes silence is an admission. Yingying understood. He asked my aunt, word by word, "Li Ruofu, I've taken all the blame for you. I have never harmed you in these 3 years. Why have you treated me this way? What exactly do you think of me?" My aunt was stunned, her lips moving but unable to find words. Yingying stood up and slowly backed away. In the flickering candlelight, I saw what seemed like tears in his eyes. He ordered the palace to be sealed, dismissing everyone around my aunt and leaving her to fend for herself. He was filled with rage. Every day, I secretly brought food to my aunt, fearing she might die. I was also afraid of being discovered, but fortunately, I managed to deliver the meals to her successfully over the next few days. Until one stormy night, I couldn't sleep. I felt something was wrong and decided to check on my aunt. In the storm, I heard the faint cries of a baby from outside the door. Through the gap in the door, I saw my aunt collapsed on the ground, with a baby wrapped in her clothes beside her. She was lying in a pool of blood, unconscious. I went to find the guards nearby who were drinking and asked them to summon the imperial doctor, but they were unresponsive. Though I am still the empress, my position is largely symbolic. I had no choice but to run desperately to Yingying's chambers, but I was stopped by the palace servants. The servants said, "Your Majesty, The emperor is settled. Please come back tomorrow. I shouted, Your Majesty, Anne has given birth to the child, and she's dying. Yingying did not come out but sent an attendant to handle the matter. The attendant opened the palace door and brought the doctor inside. The doctor picked up the baby from the ground. It was a boy. They also began to treat my aunt, but she had already lost a lot of blood. Though the bleeding was eventually controlled, my aunt developed a high fever. The doctor said it was postpartum fever and could be fatal. It turned out that during the storm, the baby was born prematurely and with difficulty. My aunt had called for help, but no one answered, so she had to struggle alone to deliver the baby. The doctors didn't understand. My aunt had given birth before, and the baby was not large. Why was there such difficulty? I stayed by my aunt's side without rest, praying to the heavens not to take her from me. Yingying did come by. He didn't enter but stood in the storm. I asked him to come in, and only then did he slowly enter. He stood in front of the curtain, looking at my aunt, who was unconscious on the bed. In the past 3 years, I often saw him looking at my aunt this way, but whenever she turned, he would immediately look away. I had told my aunt about this, saying that Yingying always looked at her secretly. My aunt said it wasn't possible and that I must have been mistaken. She also warned me. He is like a devil, only knowing how to slaughter cities and kill. You must stay away from him. At that moment, the baby cried, and Bei Qi immediately took his hand and walked to the cradle. Father, look at your brother. Yingying picked up the child. The baby gradually stopped crying, smacking his lips, wanting to be fed. I remembered how he had cared for Bei Qi in the past, how happy he and my aunt had been together. He once told my aunt that he lost his mother when he was 2, and that his father did not love him. Since childhood, he could only watch his father from afar during festivals. He swore he would not let his child be as lonely as he had been. At that time, my aunt had held him tenderly. Now you have me and Bei Qi. In the future, we will have many more children, and you won't be lonely anymore. The past memories are vivid. The people are still here, but things have changed. 14. 2 days later, my aunt suddenly woke up. I thought she was improving, but the doctors believed it was just a temporary revival before her death. I thought I had misheard and repeatedly urged the doctors to examine her thoroughly. My aunt grasped my hand. Don't be sad. It's my time to go. Then she spoke of many incredible things. She told me this was her 3rd reincarnation. In her first life, after my maternal grandfather's family and my mother died, she married the envoy whom Yingying had killed. She had hoped her husband had the ambition to save the country and would help her rescue me, her niece. But he turned out to be weak and timid. When Yingying surrounded Yunzhou, he voluntarily offered gold, silver, and maidens for peace. Bei Qi accepted their terms, but then reneged after receiving the goods, using the resources from Wu land to more quickly destroy Wu. Several cities in Wu were slaughtered under Yingying's orders, with bloodshed extending for miles. She and countless other women were captured and sent to Bei Qi's army, which was a hell on earth. She inquired about me from the Bei Qi people, but learned that I had died of illness in Bei Qi in the 3rd year of my marriage. She lost all hope of survival and died by throwing herself on a Bei Qi soldier's sword. In her 2nd life, she was reborn on the day my uncle was shot to save her. She still didn't manage to save him. After grieving, she voluntarily requested to marry into Bei Qi. After the old emperor died, she became the favorite concubine of the new emperor. She finally saw me. In this life, she didn't let me die at 8, but still couldn't change the fate of Wu's destruction. The new emperor died of excessive debauchery, leaving no heirs, so Yingying took the throne by virtue of his military power. However, his excessive bloodshed earned him the title of tyrant, and he was assassinated at 27. And I also couldn't escape. That year, I had just turned 15. In this 3rd life, she was reborn on the road to marriage. She discovered that the one escorting her was actually Yingying, and she had unintentionally touched his hand while getting into the carriage. Although he had a cold face, his ears turned red. In that moment, she made a decision to use him in this life. So that night at the inn, She drugged his water and became his woman. Although Wu land was still destroyed, she managed to protect the people and avenge my mother and uncle. 15. I betrayed my ancestors and family, and I deserve to die. So Ying, you don't need to be sad, she murmured. I thought this must be a dream of hers. I had never heard of someone reincarnating in such a way. I hoped it was just a dream. Otherwise, how painful it must be to repeatedly experience so much. After a while, she asked me, has Yingying come in the past few days? I nodded. He did. He also executed the palace guards on duty that day. I'm sending someone to call him now. She stopped me, asking me to help her dress and groom herself first. She said that since he had come to see her, it meant he didn't truly hate her. She wanted to make plans for me and Bei Qi while he still loved her and felt guilty. Bei Qi was still peacefully asleep, unaware that her mother would soon be gone. My aunt kissed Bei Qi's face. I used to dislike her because she was Yingying's child. Now I regret not loving her more. Ing, please take care of things in the future. I cried as I retrieved her imperial robes and carefully helped her dress. The people of Bei Qi were right. She was indeed extraordinarily beautiful, captivating to the heart. If Wu had been a strong country, she would have lived happily with my uncle, who had a refined and gentle demeanor. But alas, there are no what-ifs.
16.
Yingying arrived. He looked much more haggard. My aunt stood on the steps and smiled at him. You're here. He was visibly moved. Why are you standing in the wind? Be careful not to catch a cold. They entered the palace, and the door was closed behind them. I sat alone on the long steps, just as I had on the night before we left for the south. The cool breeze still blew, the summer insects still chirped, but there were no longer the whispered exchanges between lovers. Only my tears fell on the steps. Eventually, the door opened. I looked back to see a pink hibiscus butterfly fluttering out. It circled around me once before landing on my shoulder. I reached out to touch it, but it fluttered its wings and, in the silvery moonlight, vanished forever into the wind. 17. After my aunt's death, Yingying posthumously honored her as empress and made her son the crown prince. As for me, he deposed me from my position as empress and granted me the title of princess of Jin Kingdom. When he ascended the throne, he had promised to restore my status as princess. He kept his word. I continued to live in the palace, taking care of my aunt's 2 children with all my heart. Bei Qi often asked where her mother had gone, and I told her she had gone to the place she most wished to be, and that someday we would all reunite there. Chongping grew up healthily, and Yingying raised him by his side. 3 more years passed. I was 15 and Yingying was 27. According to my aunt, he would be assassinated during the New Year's festival that year, and I would also die. Fortunately, when dawn came, everything was as usual, and we were all safe and sound. Yingying heeded her final wishes and treated the people of Wu well, reducing taxes and allowing them to recover. He did not become the tyrant of the previous life. When I was 16, he arranged a marriage for me with the son of his most trusted official. He was a somewhat arrogant young man, but blushed when I took his hand willingly. Yingying prepared a generous dowry for me and personally saw me off. The day before the wedding, I visited my father. Yingying did not kill him, but confined him in my grandfather's residence. When I went to see him, he was nearly insane, saying he often saw the spirits of my grandfather's family and my mother demanding his life. He begged me to ask Yingying to release him. How absurd! The person he feared was someone I longed to see but could not. I told him, "Father, you should live here well. I will provide you with the best living arrangements and ensure you live a long life." He cursed me for being unfilial, saying he would rather raise a dog than me. I told the guards, cut off his food for 3 days. When I left, I went to my uncle's garden. The golden peach tree had long withered, with no signs of life. I took a branch and planted it in front of my aunt's tomb. May the withered tree meet the spring again. And may the butterfly that flew away with the wind eventually settle on the green tree it likes. 18. When I gave birth to my first child, Yingying suddenly passed away. He had just turned 30 that year. Old wounds resurfaced, and after drinking, he passed away in his sleep. I went to see him. He was holding the clothes my aunt wore during her marriage, his expression peaceful, as if asleep. After my aunt's death, I always thought he would forget quickly. After all, there were so many beautiful women in the palace, and he was an emperor expanding his territory, not bound by love. Perhaps my aunt was right. She died when he loved her the most and felt the most guilty, so he couldn't let go. At this moment, I was also saddened. He had given me care since I was 5 years old. Though he had frightened me at times, he had never been harsh with me. I was also relieved that he died, without suffering. In the past, people had cursed him to an unfortunate end, but now he left peacefully, indicating that the curse was ineffective. Thus, my aunt's oaths were also null and void, and she would not fall into hell and never reincarnate again. Bei Qi and Chongping cried sadly. The siblings already understood the parting of life and death. But I could not be distracted. The death was kept secret. I first found the tiger seal, and my husband also took over the Forbidden Army. My father-in-law then delayed the imperial relatives and old officials who tried to break into the palace with his hundreds of students at the palace gate. On the next day's court session, Chongping was already seated on the dragon throne when I announced Yingying's death. After that, I acted as regent until Chongping turned 17. On the day power was fully transferred to Chongping, I climbed the high city wall. The evening breeze blew gently, and the sunset stretched my shadow long. I looked into the distance. Though it was not exactly a time of peace, it was somewhat tranquil. The people from the south and north, though not completely integrated, were getting by. Bei Qi married her beloved, and Chongping stabilized the realm. I, this little fool, also found my own happiness. Min Zhao, it's time to go back, my husband said, draping a cloak over me. I nodded and walked with him out of the palace walls. On the return carriage, I heard someone call, "Little fool, hurry up." I lifted the curtain to see a few mischievous children playing and chasing each other on the long street. I didn't know which one was the little fool. But now, just like me in the past, even if they're little fools, they are happy little fools. "What's wrong?" my husband asked. I smiled. "Nothing, let's go home."